pleasure to be here. I think I give seminar papers in Durham more often than anywhere else. I'm very pleased to be doing that. It's a project for which I have a lot of respect, so nice to be here with you again. And talking about hope, as Chris says. My approach to this subject, as with everything I do, is really interdisciplinary, bringing together psychology and theology. That's what I've been doing for 20 years. And quite a lot of work has been done in that area, but there are also a lot of topics where there's a need for some interdisciplinary work between psychology and theology that has not yet been done. So if anyone's looking for PhD topics, I think this is a field in which there are still plenty to be found, unlike the New Testament, where you can't find anything fresh to do at all. My background was originally in psychology, but with some philosophy as well in my first degree, and then picked up some more formal academic theology at a later stage. And it does seem to me that it's a fruitful conjunction of topics. There are a lot of issues about human nature that are fruitfully looked at from this binocular perspective, to use a word that's much loved by my friend John Polkinghorne, the binocular perspective of science and theology. They illuminate different aspects of many topics, and I think you get at the truth of things better by taking both perspectives into account rather than just focusing on one and ignoring the other. Of course, they each have their own point of view, and that's inevitable. There is no academic discipline on earth that has a view from nowhere, to use a famous philosophical phrase. Every discipline has its own perspective, and psychology is more nitty-gritty, cold-faced, getting down to empirical details. Theology is more panoramic, big picture, putting things in context. But this is a fruitful combination, I think, and it's worth putting the two together. So that's my methodological kind of opening paragraph. And I want to talk about hope and, to some extent, optimism as well, and to draw the distinction between hope and optimism. And I want to bring this to bear particularly on mental health issues. And this leads me to say something at an early stage about the hopelessness theory of depression. And I want to come back and critique that from a couple of points of view in the course of the seminar. It's a theory that was developed out of an earlier theory of Martin Seligman's, the so-called learned helplessness theory of depression. Seligman was bouncing off some rather unpleasant experiments on animals, where it seemed if animals had nasty things done to them and there was nothing they were able to do to avoid nasty things happening to them, then they experienced what Seligman called a state of learned helplessness, in which they behaved in ways that Seligman thought looked a bit like the way depressed people behaved. So he developed this idea that depression arises from an experience of learned helplessness, that if unpleasant things keep on happening to you and you have no capacity to do anything about them, that makes you depressed. It's not a stupid theory. I think there's more to depression than that, but it's not a stupid theory. And this theory got reformulated after a little while, and I think there are two main aspects of this reformulation. One is to emphasize more strongly the interactive nature of it, that it's a conjunction of unpleasant experiences and the assumptions you make about causal control of them that is liable to make you depressed. I'm using unpleasant experiences as a kind of shorthand, and I'm including in that disappointment, nice things that you had hoped for and expected not happening, what in the old days of the psychology of conditioning people used to call frustrative non-reward, that seems to function pretty much like punishment in many ways. So unpleasant experiences is a shorthand that includes that. And in terms of getting depressed, you may be all right if nothing unpleasant is happening to you, or if you have a constructive attributional style. But if negative things, unpleasant things are happening to you, and you have a depressogenic attributional style, that's when you are liable to go under. And the reformulated theory brought out that interaction more clearly. And the depressogenic attributional style, three aspects of that got pulled out more clearly when the theory was reformulated. If you attribute unpleasant things to yourself rather than to external factors, and if you think those unpleasant things are stable, that is not likely to change. And if you also see them as pervasive, not just applying to this particular little thing, but likely to apply to a whole range of things. If you have a way of attributing events that puts unpleasant experiences down to things that are internal, stable, and global, then you're likely to get depressed. So the hopelessness theory of depression is a kind of spin-off of that. And various connections, I think, are being suggested between hopelessness and depression. One of them is just that hopelessness is a feature of depression, a kind of symptom of it, that one of the characteristics of depressed people is that they tend to be hopeless, and I think that's not particularly controversial. And another is that hopelessness is a final sort of common pathway towards depression. There are various ways in which you can become hopeless, but once you have got hopeless, that is likely to result in depression. And that's probably not too controversial either. And then there was also a suggestion that there's a particular subtype of depression that you can call hopelessness depression. And that probably is the most controversial of these three supposed linkages between hopelessness and depression, but it's not one I think that I particularly need for the purposes of this paper. So I want to keep this hopelessness theory of depression in mind, and I want to come back and critique it. And I'm going to do that from 2 points of view. I want to look a little bit more broadly at the kind of psychology of hope that is the soil out of which this hopelessness theory of depression comes. And much the most influential work in the psychology of hope has been done by a guy called Snyder. And he to my mind, emphasizes much too much the capacity that people have to influence the things that happen to them. So hope is for him a matter of expecting nice things to happen and believing that you can bring those nice things about. For Snyder, that is what hope consists of, believing that you can make the things happen that you want to happen. I think that is a seriously defective psychology of hope, and it's one that has infected this hopelessness theory of depression, amongst other things, so I want to have a go at that. And I think it can be criticised both from a psychological and a theological point of view. So that's going to be one main section of the paper, and then in another major section of the paper, I want to make the distinction that some people have made between hope and optimism, and in the current literature, a recent book by Terry Eagleton on hope without optimism is probably the best known source of this distinction. And I want to argue that the so-called hopelessness theory of depression is really a pessimism theory of depression if you make that distinction. But that hope may actually be more important to depression than pessimism. So that's where I'm going. That's my sort of map of where this talk is heading. I have a kind of text here which, as you will have gathered, I'm not using. I'm just checking that I haven't omitted to say anything that I really needed to say before I go on to the next stage. So, two main sections of this talk. One is about the limitations of a self-efficacy approach to hope and to other things, and the other about the distinction between hope and optimism. So, as I've said, on Snyder's psychological theory, hope arises from people having goals to which they can aspire and believing in their ability to follow pathways to those goals. And I think theologically this immediately strikes you as a very odd kind of theory. It sits very uneasily with a religious sense of the providence of God. And because of that, theology provides a vantage point from which to critique this self-efficacy theory of hope. Though I think you can critique the theory from other points of view. It's not only from theology that it looks a bit odd. There's actually quite a lot of evidence to suggest that religious people tend to be hopeful when hope is assessed on a variety of measures, including Snyderian measures that emphasize your belief in your ability to bring about the things you want to bring about. But for religious people, this can't be the whole story. For religious people, hope is grounded in a God who can be trusted. And hope is primarily grounded in God before it is hope for any particular outcomes and before it depends on belief in your own ability to bring things about. I don't think belief in providence precludes confidence in your self-efficacy, in your belief in your ability to make things happen. But from a theological point of view, trust in a providential God is the kind of soil out of which belief in self-efficacy arises, rather than self-efficacy being the whole of the story. And it's quite instructive to look here at some of the research on coping styles, and particularly the coping styles that you find in religious people. And you might find that religious people believed entirely in their own ability to bring things about, though that would be theologically quite odd. Or you might find that people, religious people, thought that whether good things happened was entirely a matter of God making them happen. But actually that's not the most common coping style that you find in religious people, which is a collaborative thing. Most religious people see bringing good things about as something that people do with God, rather than you doing it on your own or God doing it on his own. And I think that's really quite an important empirical fact. I'm talking here about the research of an American psychologist of coping and of religion, Ken Parchment, that the religious coping style is primarily a collaborative coping style, God and us together, rather than just one or the other. And there may be something comparable to a belief in providence in people who have no religious beliefs. And I think providential assumptions can carry over into secular thought, even if you don't have a coherent or stable framework of belief to underpin them. I think non-religious people can have a gut level assumption that the world is providential, even without a theological set of assumptions. But I think without those assumptions, it may be belief in providence may be a bit unstable, not really intellectually coherent, and so not something that you can really depend on. There's another way in which this Snyder theory of hope is, I think, open to challenge, especially from a religious point of view, which is it assumes that our goals are clear, that we know where we're trying to get, and the question is how confident we are of being able to get there. It seems to me, at least introspectively, that human goals are often not quite clear. I often find myself hoping that things are going to turn out well, but not knowing quite what that is going to look like. Keeping an open mind about the various possible ways in which things might turn out to be all right. So I want to suggest that hope is often tied to goals that are underspecified, not really laid out very clearly. And a hopeful attitude to life seems to often to precede any specific goals. And the question is really how a kind of generalized spirit of hope is going to be cashed out in the future, rather than having very clear and specific goals in mind and estimating how well you can achieve them. Often there seems to be a very generalized hope that things will get better with no specificity about what that better state will look like. And I think Christian hope is based more on the conviction that God will help people through whatever adversity arises, rather than that God will help people to reach goals that have been precisely specified in advance. There's a helpful distinction to be made, I think, between hope in the singular and hopes in the plural. And it's a distinction I'm recalling now is made in a particular philosophical paper about hope by a lecturer in philosophy at this university, and I'm embarrassed that I don't recall his name at this point.
It's just as well.
But I think it's a useful distinction. I think this idea that hope rests on believing you can bring about certain goals is really about hopes in the plural, having a list of hopes, a list of desired outcomes, and calculating whether you're likely to be able to bring them about. And this is different from the general state of hope, which sits above or below this list of specific hopes you might have. And my hunch is that hope in the singular is more important psychologically than a list of specific hopes in the plural. And this is particularly true of eschatological hope. It's been widely recognized that the eschaton is not straightforwardly a point in historical time. It's rather the goal to which all temporal events are tending. It isn't a temporal event in itself. And if that's so, it would be a very serious distortion of eschatological hope to try to fit it into a theory of hope that was conceptualized in terms of pathways to specific goals. In fact, it seems to be in the nature of eschatological hope that what is hoped for is not fully specified. There's an openness about the hoped for goals and about when and how they might arise. And whatever view is taken of the adequacy of Snyder's theory of hope, for other kinds of hope, it seems clear that eschatological hope cannot possibly be framed in terms of a belief in one's capacity to follow pathways to the achievement of specified goals. And one reason why eschatological hope is underspecified is that it's so general, so comprehensive. There is nothing good that is not part of eschatological hope. So here the distinction collapses between what particular things are hoped for and what are not. Because eschatological hope is a comprehensive hope for everything that is good. I find it surprising that so far there's been no theological critique of this family of psychological theories that emphasize self-efficacy so much. Snyder's theory of hope is one of the family, but there are others as well. The first was actually Albert Bandura's theory of self-efficacy. There's another similar theory of self-control. And I think they're all rather narrow, limited and simplistic. And theology would be one vantage point from which you could argue this. But as I say, it can be argued from other points of view as well, and Iris Murdoch has had a good go at this kind of theory, though more as it's appeared in the philosophical than the psychological literature, particularly in her 1970 paper, The Sovereignty of Good, which was reprinted in a little book of that title, in which she emerges as a very trenchant critic of the related view of intentional man set out in Stuart Hampshire's book Thought and Action, a book that made quite a stir in Oxford philosophy about the time I was an undergraduate philosophy student in Oxford. My philosophy tutor, Geoffrey Warnock, used to give me my weekly reading list orally and used to sort of deliver this reading list with much beating of his forehead and obviously an effortful recollection of the things I ought to be reading, and with some interesting asides about them as well. And I remember his comment on Stuart Hampshire's Thought and Action. He said, "It's clearly a first-class book of some kind. The question is, what kind?" Seemed a very Oxford philosopher kind of comment. Anyway, Iris Murdoch has a very good go at this sort of intentional man. This was sort of gender-free language. For the person who makes choices and sets goals in isolation from what is around and believes that they can reach them. And there's a splendid sentence in Murdoch's paper, The Sovereignty of Good, in which she sets out her objections to this theory. "I have simple empirical objections. I do not think that people are necessarily or essentially like that. I have philosophical objections. I do not find the arguments convincing. And I have moral objections. I do not think that people ought to see themselves in that way." Pretty comprehensive, isn't it? Objecting to it on empirical, philosophical, and moral grounds. She didn't like it. And I suggest that Snyder's theory of hope, like what Murdoch calls Stuart Hampshire's man, gives an unrealistic picture of how people operate, and that the account of hope derived from it is misleading. And this kind of view has distorted psychological research in other domains as well. For example, the psychology of forgiveness sees it as the forgiveness as the specific chosen acts of particular individuals. Whereas I think Christianity sees forgiveness as participation in a God-given stream of grace, rather than something that an individual person decides to do. Christianity sees forgiveness as like virtue, acquired slowly and with difficulty, as something which, when acquired, permeates everything. So these assumptions about hope, based on self-efficacy theory, and hopelessness as a lack of it, are evident in the psychology of hopelessness as you find it in depression, Tim Beck developed a hopelessness questionnaire scale that's been quite widely used and useful to look at some of the items on that. I might as well give up because there's nothing I can do to make things better for me. And this questionnaire scale also assumes that we can know in advance what will be good and that hope's a matter of achieving predetermined goals. I never get what I want, so it's foolish to want anything. And I want to suggest that being confident of being able to achieve one's goals is only one aspect of hope, and that it's very blinkered to assume that without it there can be no hope. These self-efficacy assumptions are also deeply embedded in the hopelessness theory of depression, to which I've already referred. For example, in one of the key chapters setting it out, hopelessness is defined as the expectation that highly desired outcomes are unlikely to occur, or that highly aversive outcomes are probable, and that no response one can make will change the probability of these outcomes. So that makes clear the idea that hope rests on one's ability to bring about what you want. And if you make that assumption, what room is there for providence, or the idea of going with the flow, or for what C.S. Lewis in a famous phrase called surprised by joy? If that's what you think hope consists of, how can you be surprised by positive events in a way that will engender hope? There may be an interesting interaction here between cultural and psychological aspects. Snyder's theory of hope and Abraham's hopelessness theory of depression, with their emphasis on self-efficacy, probably reflect prevailing cultural assumptions, perhaps even more in America than here. It probably is widely assumed that unless you feel you're able to bring about a good future by your own efforts, there is no basis for hope. And the sad thing is that that prevailing cultural assumption can become a reality, and that unless people have a sense of self-efficacy, they really do start to feel hopeless. My point is that this prevailing assumption about self-efficacy is culturally contingent. Things don't have to be like this, and we don't have to live in a culture that assumes they are. There can be other bases for hope. And if there was more awareness that there can be other bases for hope in which providence plays a part, there might actually be more hope in the world. Hope that arose from a more collaborative approach to building the future. Hope that was supported by trust in providence. Some might say that that was building hope on illusion. And I'd reply that the idea that good outcomes only arise from one's own efforts, that is illusory. It distorts how things actually works, and in the process tends to kill off hope. So to summarise, I accept that lack of self-efficacy, hope, can lead to depression. But I don't think it needs to do so, because I think hope can rest on other foundations. Hope can be based on a more collaborative sense of efficacy, or on a more general providential kind of hope. And I suggest that a lack of self-efficacy hope only leads to depression, where there is no other kind of hope, and where people are unaware that there can be any other kind of hope. So that's my self-efficacy section, and I'll go on now and talk about hope and optimism. And as a first approximation, I want to suggest that optimism depends on the belief that the future is going to be good, whereas hope doesn't depend on that assumption. You can be hopeful without believing that things are going to get better. You can continue to be hopeful in a broad and general way, even when you recognise that there's little basis for predicting a good outcome. There's a sense in which you can be hopeful even in a concentration camp or with a fatal illness. And some of you may know Viktor Frankl's quite well-known book about his experience of being in a concentration camp and how he managed to sustain hope in that impossible situation in which there was no reason to expect that he would get out alive, though he actually did and was able to tell the tale. Optimism emphasizes expectations about the future and is most commonly found when circumstances are favourable. Things are good and you expect them to go on being good or expect them to get even better. But hope, in contrast, can exist in unfavourable conditions in which there are no grounds for optimism. And hope is a matter of attitude more than of expectation. Optimism is largely a matter of simply expecting things to go well and doesn't really survive a change in circumstances that leads to less optimistic predictions. Whereas hope can survive in conditions that are so bleak that optimism is impossible. And to hope in these conditions can't be based on expectations. It arises instead from basic attitudes and commitments. Theologians quite often made a distinction between hope and optimism, and so have some philosophers as well. Gabriel Marcel in European philosophy has made this distinction particularly well. I learnt it from Nicholas Lash, who tried to teach me philosophical theology in mid-career, and I was having a mid-career break and trying to learn some theology. And I was interested that Terry Eagleton's book on hope without optimism is dedicated to Nicholas Lash. So Lash seems to have influenced both Eagleton and myself on this. And I think Lash was in turn influenced by Gabriel Marcel. Snyder's Psychology of Hope and Abrams' hopelessness theory of depression both assume that hope, by definition, involves expecting good outcomes. And I think hope may involve expecting good outcomes, but it doesn't need to. And my argument here is parallel to that in the last section. I argued there that hope can be sustained without a sense of self-efficacy. And I want to argue now that hope can be sustained without even expecting the future to be good. In making this distinction between hope and optimism, it's helpful to take note of two other factors besides what you expect, and those are wish and commitment or agency. The terminology tends to be slightly different in different authors, but there's quite a good consensus that these three facets, by some name or another, expectation, wish, and commitment, are important dimensions of hope. And they come out very clearly in a delightful book on hope called Rules of Hope by the psychologist James Averill. It's about the only psychological book on hope that I know that isn't sort of mired in the Richard Snyder's preoccupation with self-efficacy. And I've always liked James Averill as a psychologist, and it's probably not an accident that he spent a chunk of his early life training in a Roman Catholic seminary and emerged knowing his Aquinas and Augustine pretty well. And I think that's always made him a sort of more broad-based psychologist than many of his contemporaries. He never became a Catholic priest, but the education has stayed with him and enriched his psychological work. Most psychologists working on hope and hopelessness have conflated hope and optimism. So what we have, what's called a psychology of hope, is I think more a psychology of optimism. And the hopelessness theory of depression might be better called a pessimism theory of depression. And I want to say that there's, as well as there being more expectation in optimism than in hope, there's more wish and desire in hope than in optimism. Optimism doesn't necessarily seem to involve any strong wish. You can just think in a fairly nonchalant, uncommitted way that things are going to be pretty good over the next few years. But if you're going to really hope, especially if you're going to hope in adverse circumstances, then hope does involve some quite intense wish and desire. I think hope is actually quite close to desire, but there's more to hope than desire. Hope is more moral than desire. I think you can desire all sorts of frivolous, nice things, but you can probably only hope for things that are worthy of hope. There's something quite constraining about the semantics of that word. And I think they're rather similar to the constraints on what you can properly pray for. You can't really properly pray for just anything that you fancy. I think there are constraints on what it is proper to pray for, and I think they're rather similar to the constraints on what it is proper to hope for. And James Averill brings that out all quite nicely in his book on Rules of Hope. And there's also more commitment in hope than there is in optimism. Being optimistic doesn't involve any strong commitment to work for a better future. You just think it's going to happen anyway, so what do you need to do? But hope does involve commitment. And I don't think this is my lapsing back into a naive sense of self-efficacy. You don't have to think you can bring about the hoped-for objective by your own efforts unaided. But you can continue to hope for things even when there's nothing you can do at present to bring it about. But if you really hope for something, and there's something you can do to bring it about, you will have to do that when the opportunity arises. And if that's not the case, then you don't really hope for it. So optimism is higher on expectancy, whereas hope is higher on commitment. All this has also been set out, as I've said, in Terry Eagleton's brilliant recent book, Hope Without Optimism. And he points out the close relationship there is between optimism and the belief in progress. Belief in progress was sort of probably at its peak around the turn of the 19th and 20th century, but took a nosedive around the First World War, from which it's never quite recovered, but it hasn't completely gone away as well. And Eagleton argues that you need some kind of belief in progress to sustain an optimistic stance. And it's not quite clear where a strong and secure basis for optimism can be found. And secular optimism probably has even more of a struggle with that than religious hope does. And I suspect that generalized pervasive optimism may be a stance that emerges from a religious faith that has migrated across into the secular world. Optimism may be a secular bastard derivative of a religiously based hope. Matt Ridley, in his engaging book, The Rational Optimist, does his best to argue for the rationality of optimism, and it's largely based on the assumption that it's one of the features of human beings that they have the capacity to tackle problems and make things better. But Eagleton does a good job of demolishing that argument and exposing what he calls the banality of optimism. That optimism is not as rational as it claims to be. There are indeed human qualities of resourcefulness that tends to make things better, but those same qualities can also make things worse. And optimism seems to depend on turning a blind eye to that. In fact, optimism emerges as a curious mixture of a basic attitudinal stance that masquerades as a rationally based expectation. It's actually, its claim to rationality is really trying to wear false colours. Hope, in contrast, I think, engages the whole person more. It brings together mind and heart and action. And a good psychological vantage point from which to improve on the narrow approach to hope and hopelessness that we currently have might be that of embodied cognition. And the assumption here is that there's no sharp division between affect and cognition. Both philosophy and psychology have recognized how closely intertwined affect and cognition are. And embodied cognition theory would lead to a proposal for an affective cognition of hope, not a narrowly intellectualist or rationalist approach to it. Embodied cognition assumes what have been called the 4 E's, that cognition is embodied, embedded, enacted, extended. And the psychology of hope that took that on board would be much better than the psychology of hope we currently have. It would also be more congenial theologically and religiously than the Snyder's psychology of hope. And I think it's important here to consider the role that practices have in engendering and sustaining hope. Every time that hope is about to die, there are things that you can do to rekindle it, such as forgiveness. And this often calls for a certain cognitive agility, a willingness to regroup after each disappointment and to act in a way that keeps hope alive. Black and white thinking makes that very difficult. Hope seems to require a trinity of hopeful feeling, hopeful narrative, hopeful practices. Hope seems to be embedded or situated. It doesn't occur outside the social context. And Snyder, another weakness of Snyder's theory is that it's too individualistic. Hope may not always be supported by the context, but at least it engages with the context. It may be contramundum, against the world, like Viktor Frankl's personal hope in a concentration camp. And I think all this really matters. I think the kind of hope that's contrasted with optimism rather than confused with it may actually be very important psychologically, very important at a human level. Though a lack of optimism, a lack of self-efficacy based optimism does seem to be associated with depression, I suspect that a lack of real hope, the kind of hope that's not dependent on optimism, may actually be even more closely associated with depression. And at least that's a hypothesis that's worth investigating. And it's one that the theological and philosophical literature might suggest to psychology. So far there's been very little empirical work on this kind of basic, generalised attitudinal hope. Though there are a couple of Polish guys whose names I'm not sure I can pronounce properly, but something like Trubinski and Zieber. They've made a start on this, drawing on Erik Erikson's concept of basic hope. And they've developed a questionnaire measure of this basic general hope, with items like, the world is good even if we're not doing well. The world is meaningful and all things have some sense even if we feel lost sometimes. As opposed to, the reality that surrounds us is inexplicable and unpredictable. Fate is unfavourable to me. They've shown that this kind of generalised hope can be measured in a reliable way by a questionnaire, and that it is different from optimism and agency-based hope. Different from in the sense that it's not particularly highly correlated with it, it's something different. I think hope is really important psychologically, and also socially, culturally, and collectively. And societies that abandon hope are really in a very difficult place. There's a deep-seated yearning for hope that, amongst other things, makes hope a good vote-winning strategy in elections. As Barack Obama showed in his, particularly his first election campaign, and Emmanuel Macron has also showed in France. And hope can be sustained by a hopeful shared narrative, like the people of Coventry Cathedral, whose cathedral was bombed and rebuilt, leading them to see it as their mission to bring reconciliation and hope to the world as best they could. Hope can crash, but it can always be rebuilt. Bill Williams, the first provost of the rebuilt cathedral in Coventry, speaking a few weeks after the new cathedral was opened, put it like this: the world is marked throughout its length and breadth by numberless places at which human hope has been crucified by man's foolishness. Some are obvious and well known, like Auschwitz or Coventry or Hiroshima, but there are many more which are not recognized as such by the masses. You do not need nails or bombs or instruments of torture to crucify human hope. You can do it with words. You can do it with political policies. You can do it with deep and unexamined historical prejudice. Day after day, the high road of history is marked by the human race as it journeys along by crucifixion places where human hope and man's natural longing for peace and unity have been done to death. And each one of them is potentially a place of resurrection. He goes on to speak of the role of Christians in this situation. And I realise that many of those who see themselves as more spiritual than religious would feel that what he says about Christians is true of them too. But speaking of Christians, this is what Bill says. That is why Christians may not hate, even though they suffer. That is why Christians may not be unforgiving, even if they cannot forget. That is why Christians may not get separated into the various irreconcilable compartments of international power politics. That is why Christians must be true to the faith which tries to reach above the bitter blow and counterblow technique of international politics, and must keep the door of reconciliation open at all costs. I want to suggest that hope is a spiritual virtue that plays a key role in human transformation. If you look at the world with hope, reconfiguring it in terms of what it might become, your hopeful vision of the world can start to become a reality. Though there are various spiritual virtues that can contribute to the transformation of the world, such as gratitude, hope probably operates more at a collective level than any other spiritual virtue. Much spirituality is rather individualistic, whereas hope comes into its own when hopes are shared. I also want to, in closing, come back to the mental health benefits of hope, real hope, generalized hope, as I've defined it here and distinguished it from optimism. And if we could find ways to strengthen that kind of genuine hope, I think there would be less depression around.